at this interview setting and session that I will have with David Bollier here on the other side of my table. David is a director of Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and the author of multiple books about commoning and commons. Well, I'm very happy basically that we finally meet in person, in the flesh.
We've done our online things, but we're nearing post-COVID.
Yes.
We hope.
Live, and we have wonderful people here as well with us. Live people. We have people at home, and more importantly, we have more than an hour to dive into the wonderful world of commons and commoning. So finally, we will have some time to get it across.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we will. And we will talk about this wonderful book, new book. And of course, you are also part of the Thrive book, where we did a lot of initiative over here in the Pakhuis. As in my humble opinion, one of the new ways of economic thinking, profoundly different, fundamentally different from the current system.
Well, since you're too modest, I will plug the anthology as a great collection of essays about thinking about new systems, or next systems.
Thank you very much. So let's start with the obvious question. What is commoning? What are commons? Yes, sorry, we have to start somewhere.
We do. I mean, the commons has an ancient history, and most of Western culture has consigned it to this archaic medieval time where it's kind of this curious artifact of history that we know the tragedy of the commons, meaning we overexploit commons, supposedly. That's the famous thesis by Garrett Hardin in a 1968 essay, which economists and politicians love to cite. And the whole point is, shared wealth is always ruined through overexploitation because no one has a so-called rational incentive to hold back and not take as much as they want. So it's rational to destroy the environment and so forth. Well, this is the conceit of standard economics of what a human being is, that you don't care about your fellow human beings, that you take all you can for yourself and you ruin the whole environment. I call it the tragedy of the market because that's what's really going on. The commons has rules, it has a community, it has governance, it punishes transgressors or free riders. So there's kind of a smear and a misconception about the commons that dominates popular understanding that we first of all have to dispel and say, no, the commons is a social system for managing shared wealth. And this takes countless forms. Whenever a community gets together and decides that they want to manage it in a participatory way with an accent on fairness and inclusion and for the long term, because they're stewards or interdependent on their shared wealth, especially ecologically. So maybe that's a good place to start in terms of the general framing of what a commons is. And I guess the last thing I will say is that Western modernity is starting to confront the fact that the human species has always been a species of commoners. They've had the conceit for 200 years or more that they're Homo economicus, and they're market creatures of transactions. But we're learning that we're actually embedded in the earth in a relational system.
Hey, and is this a misunderstanding of, or is this
a willful misunderstanding?
Yeah, because it almost sounds too good to be true, too good to be a misunderstanding.
You mean economists referring it as a tragedy?
Yes.
Well, no. I mean, it's more their worldview, their mindset,
their ontology,
their ontology of how the world works, and of course, their whole world is populated by transactions to make money, especially capital-driven markets to make investment returns. So when that's your worldview, everything else is an externality. You know, what you dump into the environment, your intrinsic feelings and motivations, if that's not part of the transaction, if that's not contributing to capital returns, what good is it?
Yeah.
You know, so it's a mindset, and unfortunately, this mindset has become the popular wisdom embraced and propagandized by the corporate world.
Yeah. Hey, and And if you look at the current state of affairs, the current state of the world, and we don't have to dive deep into this because everybody knows we're in shit. Is that a reason that we more and more start to see the commons and take them more serious? Because I have the serious impression that there's a lot more positive attention for commoning and commons.
Well, I think there's a confluence of a number of streams and rivers all coming together. I mean, I myself came to the commons in the late 90s when the internet and open source software was burgeoning, when Elinor Ostrom, the great future Nobel Prize winner of economics, was in her heyday in terms of her research. She died in 2012. But then I also think that people are starting to realize that the market state system, as I call it, because the market is so tightly allied with state power, as to be codependent and collusionary with each other, that they're realizing that that narrative that they propose is no longer credible. And in fact, it's imploding. We've seen it through the pandemic, and we see with how climate change is calling into question the whole framework of progress, economic growth, consumerism, market individualism, that this is just not a credible story anymore. And the commons is an available and compelling story with a history.
Hey, and if you take commons, and we will look at a couple of concrete examples, because I think it will help people to get a clear image of what it is. But what they all have in common, in some sense, is that they withdraw from the market and the state system, and they basically create a parallel sort of society economy that wherein people become producer and consumer both at the same time.
That's actually a very concise summary. They don't necessarily withdraw in the sense that it's more meeting needs, but it has the effect of withdrawing because you're not as dependent or subordinate on the market or state. And you're not necessarily depending on market transactions to meet your needs. You're doing it in a collaborative way with your your neighborhood, your online community, or whatever that community is.
Hey, and well, this is maybe also a very open question, but nevertheless, I think it's an important one. How do people start commons? And I don't mean the technical bit, like, what do I do to start a common, but what makes people start commons?
Well, I think historically it was simply, I think we're hardwired to cooperate. We're symbiotic with each other and with the earth. And if you look at the cultures that have survived for millennia, the indigenous cultures, that's the way they work. They could be the purest set of commons. So I think that we have these propensities, but of course culture often takes over. Civilization sometimes veers in another direction, the way we have with the Enlightenment. And maybe we've lost our way. Maybe we need to find our way back. Maybe what has been in the shadows needs to come out of the shadows and be made visible again. And I think that we're in the process culturally of trying to do that.
Hey, so in your latest book, you made an inventory of all sorts of common initiatives all over the world. And maybe it's a good idea to pick out a few so people get a grasp of how the concreteness of these initiatives.
Well, precisely because the commons is seen as obscure, arcane, unsuccessful, whatever, I wanted to sort of do a brain dump of what I regarded as the most salient features of the commons, historically, in law, in economics, in social circumstances, in the digital world, and so forth, so that my mother could understand it. So, I'm not talking as an academic or highfalutin theories, but these are examples that are actually working out there. This is not some utopian posture or, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? No, this stuff is happening. And I wanted to compile that. And I was inspired by the Whole Earth Catalog, which did that in the late 60s and early 70s, and sort of brought to the fore all these countercultural activities that were not well regarded. And then I have to say that there was the Dutch Whole Commons Catalog, which showed me, oh, wow, what a fantastic idea. And so I wanted to do my own version inspired by that.
Yeah, and well, I have to applaud you. It looks wonderful. It's a fast to read.
Thank you.
before we dive into a couple of examples, I maybe also interesting to dive into a bit from a quantitative perspective. Do you have any idea how many people worldwide are involved in Commonesque-like initiatives?
Well, see, that's an interesting question because a lot of people don't necessarily use that discourse. But and so, are they commoners or not? Yeah. And I think a lot of people in Africa and the global South, that's the routine way of doing things. You know, they don't. It
has probably been for ages.
Precisely, yeah. And they may have market relationships, but they're not necessarily capital-driven, extractive ones, the way the Western development model is, and so they often find it culturally alien, the whole development model, which has been foisted upon them. But they often have a very sustainable relationship with the land. Now, I don't want to overstate this because the commons is not some magic pixie dust or utopia.
No.
There's patriarchy, there's gender issues and ecological issues. But let's just say that a framework that has a certain hardiness and resilience and engagement with the earth, it's a proven model.
Yeah.
So let's just say there's a lot of people already have been commenting for a long time. Having said that, especially in the West and the North, a lot of people are seeing that this framework for conceptualizing this social form makes a lot of sense and is a maybe exit strategy from the dead end that we're in.
Yeah, I'm asking it because, and I don't know if you agree or the folks here that are with us, but I find more and more people that are seriously worried about the situation that we're in, and they're looking for examples to basically reimagine society, reimagine economy, and we have all these examples, but we don't see them in the mainstream media. And so therefore I ask you, because it could be really, really important to get them more out there and to create more visibility.
Well, that was one of my motivations in doing the catalog, but frankly, it was a test for me about how much mainstream institutions, especially politics and media, can stomach these ideas, can wrap their minds around it, because they've been singularly unimaginative in proposing alternatives to the status quo. And, the NGO world, the political world, the think tank world, the media world, they're stuck in the same groove. And somehow, there's efforts from the outside to try to change that. We see a lot of great developments like Extinction Rebellion, but the premium needs to be on the creative, constructive alternatives. And I think that we need to start to amass those and start to study them more intensely.
Shall we have a look at a?
Let's talk about some of them.
You probably have some of your favorites, so I will invite you to choose a first example of a comedy.
Well,
wow, yeah, that's wonderful.
I mean, I have some framing sections. These are all short sections, so it's not heavy reading. But I have a framing section, for example, on economics, where I commend Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics as a fantastic way to start to wrap your mind around this. People like David Fleming, who is a British iconoclast who wrote this fantastic dictionary of the post-capitalist world, a great book, or even Illich, the Catholic social critic from the 70s, is very timely. So I have framing like that. But then,
why did you choose these three examples? Just to, for instance, Kate.
One could name others, but they they contextualize economics within social and cultural contexts.
Yeah, okay.
And they realize that human beings are spiritual creatures even.
Yeah.
And how can this be part of the conversation? How can our non-market identities, how can care work, feminist economics, that contributes a lot to this too.
I agree. Yes.
And so how can these relational forms start to inform economics, which is kind of a desiccated, sterile framework of what a human being is.
Yeah, so
I frame with that.
Yeah, so you reframe economics. Yeah.
Our very idea of the economy needs to be enlarged so that it's not just the transaction that capital does. It's the communities.
Yeah.
It's the interactions. It's our humanity.
Yeah, because I also saw an image, the famous image of the iceberg with the community economy and then the formal economy. And of course, the community economy is way bigger.
Yes, I mean, once you start to talk about the informal economy and barter and care work and all the rest, that's the iceberg.
Yeah.
And then you just have this tiny little bit that creates GDP, which is supposedly gross domestic product, which is supposedly the significant stuff.
One can argue.
So, but you asked about, let me, I didn't answer about examples. You know,
reclaiming the land, that's a really important one, I think.
Well, the land is a very important topic.
Yes.
Because it's kind of critical infrastructure for living, and it's the way we engage with the earth. I think one of the hardiest models is the community land trust, which provides a way to decommodify land. And by doing that, especially for farmers, there are other uses of land trust, but for farmers, it allows them to grow in a more responsible way without these market pressures to grow as much as they can and use the chemical pesticides and, you know, crank it out and serve export markets, for example, as opposed to serving your bioregion. So finding ways to take property out of the market, to decommodify it, opens up freedom, actually.
Yeah, and how does one do that? Decommodify?
Well, in that case, there is a whole tradition over the past 40 or 50 years of community land trust acquiring land and acting as the trustee for that land and keeping it permanently off the market. So it's not going to be resold later. And with that assurance, lots of people or farmers, sometimes it's used for affordable housing or for other purposes, you can start to open up the uses of the land in more constructive or benign ways.
So, yeah, we have initiatives like this in the Netherlands with Land van Ons, for instance, and Aardpeer. You probably know these folks.
And your own envisioned food park, you know, an attempt to get urban land devoted to regional food production is a great way to develop community identity and commitment to the land, appreciation for ecosystems, and to insulate us from volatile global supply systems and become more resilient. You know, and it's sort of placing a bet on a different kind of future as opposed to placing a bet on the endless growth cycles that are destroying the earth.
And now I have to admit, of course, that this is my bubble. So my view is not clear, but I have the impression that these initiatives are getting more and more popular. So I hear a lot more people, but again, I have to admit I'm in my echo chamber. So it could be my bubble, but do you agree? Is it? Yeah, it is getting more popular. Eh? Yeah. Is that only here, or is it?
Well, it's impressionistic. How are you going to judge? But I like to think that you know, if we're part of Gaia, the Earth as a living system,
yes, and
I think the Earth is speaking to us, and I think this is some of the things that we respond the way we respond, because I think that we, at a certain deep level, are yearning for this different kind of connection, and that the consumerism of the global economy is not going to satisfy that.
No. So that's another really important aspect of commoning, eh? The social and ecological or environmental symbiosis. Eh? So it's both from a human-centric perspective as well as life-centric, and the blend of those two. Eh?
Yeah, starting to realize, I mean, I think in some ways this is an epical moment in trying to resituate humanity within the context of the Earth as an ecosystem in a serious way, getting beyond the notion of the Anthropocene, that we're actually going to be able to control it and govern it. No, we're going to have to become deeply integrated and interdependent on it and learn how to be not stewards in an anthropocentric sense, but co-communicants of living beings with the earthly systems.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, there's a whole rise of a so-called new animism movement, not animism as a so-called primitive thing that anthropologists of 100 years ago studied, but in cultural studies and many other fields, eco-philosophy, they're starting to approach the world as a living system in a serious way.
Yes.
And that we have biosemiotics with the rest of the world. We communicate with our bodies, communicate with it. So we're not just this rational creature. We are living beings in a living system. So once you approach the world that way, your perspective changes.
Kind of, yes.
And you start to realize, oh, I want to be a commoner with the earth in a way. The way indigenous peoples have, they have a different set of problems than we do in the North in terms of escaping the Western modernity and finding our way back. They simply want to protect what was theirs. Yeah. But I think this is more of a quest and a becoming rather than a blueprint. Yeah. It's not an ideology. It's something that we all have to participate in.
Is there some sort of common thread amongst commoners from a drive perspective? Is it care-driven, or is it maybe anger, or what drive? Yeah, and of course there are, as you know, there are as many drives as people. I get it.
It's hard to generalize, but I do think that there are a reassertion of certain human attributes or values. Care is certainly one of them.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of attributes that go beyond buying and selling.
Yeah.
This is the quest that a lot of commons are seeking. I don't want to get too mystical about it, because some things are kind of like it's socially satisfying. To be part of an open source software community can be immensely gratifying, and it's not necessarily have a mystical element. No. But you can talk about a lot of natural resource commons for fisheries or bodies of water or mountains, and there's definitely a deeper element going on that people are tapping into.
Yeah. May I ask you what is driving you? What's emotion?
I was a product of 1970s suburban America, and I was fortunate to have a political education with the consumer advocate Ralph Nader in the 70s and 80s. And I saw a different narrative about the modern world than I had received as a child and youth. So in some ways, I'm probing some of these deeper dimensions as kind of a itinerant scholar activist, studying dozens of different commons. I've been studying the commons for about 20 years, and mostly focusing on European and American, some global South, but I just haven't traveled there enough. But this has been outside of the academy and outside of the nonprofit world. And so I've kind of had a searcher perspective in looking at these things, as opposed to a disciplinary perspective or even necessarily a policy or political objective.
So curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah, wonderful.
And I find so inspiring certain commons that just bowl me over. I was in India, and I met some women 2 hours outside of Hyderabad, and they used to be bonded laborers on somebody else's farm, and they could only afford one meal a day. And then they discovered in their grandmother's bureaus these saved seeds from a generation or two ago. And they said, oh, there's a tract of land that we can put some manure on, we can get it going, we can use these seeds. And it had a different form of agriculture, where instead of monoculture from Western seeds, it was indigenous seeds that they did them together, because there are 5 or 6 different seeds. And it was like an insurance portfolio where you had different seeds, and no matter whether it was cold or wet or dry, some would come up. And in other words, recovering their old ways was enough to make them they were able to emancipate themselves from being bonded laborers and become sovereign people in control of their destiny, more in control of their destiny, still poor. But my point is, the empowerment of becoming a commoner, of not being dependent in those ways, is moving.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people want to go, and not have these outside economic forces or billionaires or corporations essentially framing their life and telling them what they're going to do.
Yeah, I think that is what triggers me most with commons. I grew up 10 years later, so I grew up with punk rock, and punk rock, of course, is about do it yourself. And what I really find fascinating about Commons is that the empowerment bit. That that once you take hold of life, you take control of your own destiny. That you find that you have a lot more power than you think you have.
And what the funny thing that I've discovered as well is that, there's a great Goethe quote: "At the moment of commitment, the universe conspires to your success." And you find that things emerge when you commit to a certain thing.
Yeah.
And that, oh, this person wants to join me and he has that talent. Oh, this happened. And it's a different way of moving in the world, but it seems to succeed.
Yeah.
And I think that's a path that more people need to explore.
Yeah. Hey, food and agriculture, that's another really important one as well.
It's hugely important because it's a major contributor to global carbon emissions.
Yeah, so our current food system is broke.
But there are the problem is that food is treated as a raw commodity, and so the market dictates where there's going to be hunger, and who cares if there's waste, because it's we can't make money off of that, and we can't sell it. The demand isn't there. But there are different ways to grow than industrial agriculture and monoculture that are more benign, that can produce enough food and distribute it more fairly. Both are important. Agroecology, for example, is a growing tradition, more interested in it. Permaculture has articulated certain principles of sustainability in working with the earth. And in both of these cases, it's treating the earth with respect as a living system and working with it in a symbiotic way, as opposed to simply extracting it and treating it as an inert, dead matter in which to grow food.
And how would that work in a commoning context? Do you have an example of a food and agriculture?
Well, there's a lot of, in the global south, it's far more sophisticated and developed because they've been doing this for millennia. But oftentimes their religious traditions or culture are wrapped into the ecological needs, so that their culture is supporting them to do the right thing. So, for example, there's a brief section in Bali, I believe it is, or not Bali, I'm blanking, but they have these elaborate religious rituals to time how the irrigation occurs, and it does it in a way that doesn't overexploit the available water. So the Western scientists will say, oh, that's just religious superstition that's going on here. But in fact, it's a way for them to self-regulate and control how they grow their food. Yeah. So we can learn, I think, a lot from the global south in terms of respectful interaction with the land over the long term, and try to escape some of the practices we have in industrial agriculture.
Yeah, so how problematic is that in your opinion?
Well, it's obviously a formidable challenge because the political system supports mostly the system of growing food. And it's wrapped up in the lack of access to land, which is also a formidable challenge. Yeah. But the future doesn't look too bright for the existing system, which depends heavily on the pesticides and nutrients, the fertilizers. So we have to find our way there. We do have these models, but there has to be a will, there has to be political support. And I think the people who are engaged in these alternative practices have to horizontally discover each other and self-support each other. And that's where I think the word and discourse of the commons helps, because it can knit together diverse types of communities under a single type of language and exploration. They're not going to all be doing the same thing because one context is different from another, but they will understand that they're working with a similar methodology.
Yeah, so we basically need some sort of an emancipation of the grassroots movement. We have to, they have to stand up and be counted.
I mean, I think there's room for a lot of change in the grassroots movements. Yeah. I think, one, they need not be so much of silos. They ought to understand that this is a larger challenge, and that, for example, I was thrilled and astonished to see that some defectors from the fashion and garment production industry are interested in the commons. Because how many of you know that there's huge amounts of fast fashion clothing that is simply shipped to Africa and dumped? Huge pollution and waste from dyes as well. And so, reinventing capitalist fashion and realizing that's akin and has the same problems of agriculture, there's this kind of solidarity that begins to emerge when we realize that the enclosures of the commons are happening everywhere, and commoning is a solution in a similar way cross-sectorally.
Yeah. Hey, one of the chapters in your new book is called The Cooperative Solution. And maybe it's also good to look at the similarities and the differences between cooperatives and commons, or are these synonymous?
Well, commons or cooperatives are definitely part of the solution. The problem is that many cooperatives see themselves only in their market identity as market competitors and serving consumers, and that's fine as far as it goes. But some become major quasi-corporations who call themselves cooperatives, and they're not really involved in the betterment of society. They're more like we'll give you a few percentage points back at the end of the year as a rebate. So there are co-ops and there are co-ops. I would also add the younger generation is experimenting with new forms of co-ops, like platform cooperatives online, where users and workers are owning the platform and getting the benefits, as opposed to Airbnb or Uber simply extracting from those workers. So that's one example. There's notions of distributed cooperatives, or the acronym DISCO, where they're online vehicles for communities to cooperate together. So these kind of experiments are very interesting. Oh, one other I really need to mention. There's a notion called exit to community, where you get a company started, and usually the next step is to sell out through a so-called IPO to the public capital markets. But what if you took an exit to community where you sold your company to the community, and the community had first option to own that enterprise? And a lot of startup entrepreneurs are saying, I don't really just want to sell out to Wall Street. I want my business to have some purpose and function and stability with the community. So there's now a new financial paradigm of exit to community. Yeah. And this came out of the younger generation of co-op people as well.
Yes, we also see a lot of initiatives now in the Netherlands that I think it's called steward leadership, where and very interesting that a lot of social enterprises that make their way from you could say, classic corporation model to cooperatives as a way of scaling up in a very different way. Really interesting.
And I applaud all of these experiments and innovations, the so-called for-benefit companies or purpose-driven companies. But I then want to ask the hard questions of, can this be liquidated in the future or privatized? Is certain shared wealth protected, or is it just a market enterprise? What is the nature of that social commitment? Is it simply a marketing identity to make you feel good and run another scam on consumers? So I think those are serious questions that need to be asked. At the same time, we do need the innovation in social forms. And, we're not going to get rid of the major corporations tomorrow, but I think the center of gravity could change towards these more socially committed and structurally sound alternatives. Yeah. And that could be a force for change.
Hey, so in commoning and in commons, there is a triad. And you've written quite elaborately about this in Free, Fair and Alive. Maybe it's good. This is a good moment to take these three elements to give people a bit more insight of how a common works from an organizational perspective.
Well, the standard academic way of talking about commons is commons as resources. It's talking about it within the standard economic framework of rational actors and so forth. And this is what the great political scientist Elinor Ostrom did in her celebrated work. But when my co-author Silke Helfrich and I were writing our 2019 book, Free, Fair, and Alive, we came to realize that, a commons is not just a resource as a resource, it's a social system. And so we realized that we had to do what, excuse the term, an ontological shift or onto shift in understanding that a commons is not just, oceans, internet, space, this lake. It's a social system for governing those things. And the point is many of those resources don't have governance, commons governance yet, even though the nation state presumes to carry that mantle. So we wanted to elaborate on how the commons as a social system functions on the inside. Yeah. The economics has homo economicus and the rational actor in the marketplace, bartering, and so forth. We came up with what we call the Triad of Commoning, which consists of provisioning, which is, didn't want to call it production because the twin of that is consumption.
The narrative is important, eh?
Yes. So we call it provisioning. And peer governance, where there's forms of the community governing it. And why am I blanking?
Socialize.
That's socialize. Thank you. All of these are all of these are interdependent and overlapping, but we wanted to define each sphere because there are certain patterns. And I stress that this is not a blueprint, but we used what is called the pattern language methodology that Christopher Alexander, this you might call dissident, Buddhist-inspired urbanist, developed. And what he looked at was how social practices from the bottom up surface into certain patterns. And you'll see that people walk across the lawn in this way or do something else that way, because over time it has proven to be a useful, socially satisfying way of doing it. So we wanted to look at the patterns of commoning that had emerged, in very different context, but were similar patterns, because they were different ways of solving the same problem, and they seemed to cluster in certain patterns. So we identified, there's no magic number about this, but 25 or 30 in those three spheres. And these are kind of touchstones that people can look at. So for example, in peer governance, you have to do things like share knowledge transparently in a spirit of trust. So it's not just being transparent and putting the information out, but in a trusting context.
Yeah, because there is a very clear structure necessary in commoning.
Well, yes, there are certain recurrent social forms and attitudinal approaches and values that manifest in commons. And it can be, I don't care if it's a software coding commons or a mountain protection commons or a fishery commons. You have to bring the diversity of people into common purpose, for example. You have to develop systems of trust. There's all these different ways. You have to develop systems for dealing with money that don't allow money and markets to colonize and destroy the community. So,
and these are all based upon shared agreements.
They're shared agreements, and they're based on, I'd say, numerous examples in which people realize if the money is dictating how things happen, it's going to destroy the community. So we say keep commerce and commoning distinct. And you have to devise certain buffers or intermediaries for dealing with the market. It doesn't mean you can't deal with the market. It just means you have to be mindful in how you're dealing with the market so the market doesn't destroy you or appropriate your shared wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So these are the kinds of things, and it maybe sounds a little fuzzy to people, but you have to realize you have to enact the commons in your context. So it's not going to be the same as others. You'll have different personalities, a different landscape, different political environment.
They're all quite distinct. Eh?
They're all quite distinct. And so for many people, this is like a confusing array of different things. that's why we develop the patterns, because there are these regularities that are across many commons.
Shall we dive a bit deeper in provisioning as well, because it's a lovely
Sure.
it's a lovely subject as well. So you've used the term to make sure that people don't think of it as production. But what is it?
Well, it's producing for your needs.
Yeah.
It's not producing
Sufficiency.
it's not producing for market purposes necessarily. You may sell to the market the way, for example, a coastal fishery will, for a community, will sell to the market. But you do under terms that don't deplete the resource, and you do it in a way that assures that people's local needs are met. And so there's an element of fairness in distribution that is also part of the equation. It's not just produce as much as we can and sell as much as we can. So it's a different paradigm, a different logic, a different ethic, a different worldview, you might say.
That's one of the, you could say, economic wonders, that we've been so accustomed with, the demand and supply and, growth, and it has to be more. And that, in commons, you basically see the opposite working, that people are
in the
very
economics, introduction to economics textbooks, you just get the tragedy of the commons, and you don't even talk about the commons because there's no money changing hands. So how could it be interesting? Yes. Yet it's meeting the needs of billions of people every day. Yeah. And so, this is, I think, a rather profound...
sufficiency.
Yes, sufficiency. And arguably, that's what the Western world needs to learn, is that sufficiency is okay.
Yeah.
And sufficiency is something we're going to have to come to terms with, given where we've gone with the modern economy.
And last but not least, social life, which is one of the aspects I'm really fond of as well.
Well, we have lots of things where, you have to develop this sense of, one of our patterns was ritualized togetherness. You need to have festivals and fun, but you also need to deal frankly with the embarrassments and problems and deficiencies without recrimination. The point is to preserve relationships while dealing with these issues. And Silke and I saw some commons where, they would have some pretty hard discussions, but it was all for the durability of the community because they had to get it right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about ostracizing some people. Some people, what's fascinating, would say, I'm going to do this in defiance of the community. And the community would basically say, okay, you're not a part of us anymore. And sometimes that's a very profound cost imposed by a commons. Now,
I love the term you use in the book, Ubuntu relationality.
Right. Well,
I love it.
We sort of, the more we got into economic rationality, well, that's pathology. So we said, what is the rationality in a commons? Ubuntu is this Bantu South African term for, it means essentially, or in crude translation, I am because we are. Yes. And the sense of the interpenetration of the self and the collective, not in some sort of, I don't know, communistic way where some collective dictates everything, but more of a conversation back and forth in which you're deeply embedded in a community. And in fact, that's the way it is even in capitalism. We're part of the engineered social community that advertising creates. And we've internalized that. Yeah. So why not internalize the best of what our community wants to be?
Yeah, I totally agree. just to make sure, folks, do you get this? Because I want to make sure that everybody understands the basic, the dynamics, the fundamentals of because the triad is one of the fundamentals.
Well, maybe I should tick through a few more examples just to sort of...
Please, do.
I'm thinking that... because we were starting to get into we did talk a little bit about the land and agriculture, but the digital form has lots of commons, from Wikipedia to open source software. There's open access scholarly publishing where academics can publish without commercial publishers simply appropriating the benefits of academic commons. There's something called open educational resources where, a lot of students can't afford the textbooks because they're so expensive, but now they've developed these print-on-demand at cost textbooks as a commons.
Yeah.
So there's a textbook commons. So there's all these types of irregular commons that people ingeniously have created. There's a humanitarian open street map team that in the wake of natural disasters will use, they're a bunch of hackers and open source people who create maps of the disaster area to say, here's the water, here's the hospitals, here's the emergency crew to help out. This is like
there's a lot of creativity in there as well.
There's a lot of creativity, and it's very quick, faster than the Red Cross even. Yeah. And, this is sort of the example of how, mutual aid networks during the pandemic, how they can function with care, with speed, with creativity. In a way,
and maybe that's also good news because whether we like it or not, we are entering an era of existential crisis, and people tend to show common-esque behavior in the face of crisis.
There's the famous book by Rebecca Solnit, Paradise Built in Hell, which is about...
speaking of cool titles.
which is about natural disasters and how people responded in the face of earthquakes or explosions or fires with the most noble...
Yeah, we get social. Yeah.
Yes, totally social. And they look back fondly on that hellish experience, saying it was transcendent.
Yeah. With your permission, I would like to go into politics for a couple of minutes.
You can't avoid it.
No, I can't afford it. And this is a bit of an anecdote, but really funny in this case. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Queen's Day in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Which is a day that the whole of the Netherlands turns into a big flea market. And I went to a flea market in Groningen, which I live near Groningen. It's a student city. And I came across this book. It's called, as you can see, Anarchism, From Bakunin to the Commons. And there's actually a big section on you in the book.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, it is. I studied political science, and I had the anarchist studies as one of the subjects or topics of my study. And until the day of today, it still is my favorite subject. But what I found really interesting is that the writer, which is a Belgian professor, Ludo Abicht, makes a very compelling case that commons basically could be the future of anarchism. So what do you think about it? Because commons in themselves aren't specifically politic.
Well, I mean, I in a general sense resonate with that. As I've mentioned before, there are many different flavors of anarchism, and the popular understanding of anarchism is that, violent,
yes,
etc. So you need to sort of get through the haze of misconception or what you're talking about. But the idea that individuals have these capacities, have the desire for this level of freedom without the oppressive structures of capital-driven markets or the state power, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that David Graeber's latest book, The Dawn of Everything, also points to this through incredible archaeological, historical scholarship to show that even early cities were not necessarily these hierarchical enterprises driven by the new agriculture, but there was this anarchistic spirit to many of them. So his point was that this is a far more plausible, if not compelling, explanation that we could maybe consider today. And I think in light of internet culture, which has also shown that we can self-organize, self-govern in ways, let's just bracket, there's also the corporate misbehavior that also has to be dealt with. And I would also add that there's a lot of theoretical work that needs to be done to understand how digital governance can occur, because it's a different kind of human interaction than in person or local. That said, those caveats, I think anarchism has a very important it's a feeder stream in terms of the conception of what a human being is and could do. And we do have to work out the functional institutional systems so that it's not simply everyone does what they want. There is a certain community ethic that has to be binding as well. Some anarchists find that objectionable.
Yes. Well, one of the things that because I don't think we have much debate about this, that, you know, with the power and the power structure of both the market and state, that we need to empower the civil society, and anarchism could be an interesting way to do it.
It's an interesting point of departure. I think really what's interesting is that the Commons allows many access points. Anarchism is one. You know, my colleague Silke Helfrich had once said that it's really trans-ideological, in that liberals like it because it deals with controlling the market. Leftists like it because liberals are social responsibility. Leftists like it because controlling the market. Libertarians like it because of individual initiative. Freedom. A lot of conservatives like it because of its community responsibility and orientation. You know, so it's not, I think it escapes the left-right spectrum because it's really dealing more pragmatically and not with these abstract cudgels that you hit someone with. Yeah. It's more about making it work. And I think human beings have that capacity to relate that way if there's the right frame and it can be nurtured and not simply be a political weapon.
Well, he basically positions commons as the new anarchism. So, commonism. Are you ready for that?
I'm not sure. I don't accept the ism. I think that the point is that the commons cannot be contained in an ideology because the human spirit and creativity and circumstances are far more diverse. I'm constantly surprised at the types of commons I encounter. There's a HowlRound, a theater commons in Boston, which coordinates the non-commercial theater throughout the United States and even the rest of the world. You know, so my point is, commons have it's sort of like an ecosystem where you have how many dozens of types of flowers or different types of small animals or whatever. And then evolution comes along and says, we're going to create this in this niche. You know, and if you read biologist Lynn Margulis about symbiosis and evolution, you know, niches occur and something pops up. Well, so I'm constantly amazed. It's like a work of art of living systems manifesting in ways like a commons.
Yeah, it truly is a wonder, eh? Yeah. Hey, we almost have to stop the live stream bit. We will go further into dialogue with the folks over here. But last question: what do you think will happen in the next couple of years with commons and commoning?
Well,
I'm not asking you to be a forecaster or whatever, but
I'm not going to predict because there's so many variables out there. But personally, I see a need to develop some new infrastructures to make it less formidable to become a commoner and to normalize it. So, for example, we need what I call relationalized finance, different types of finance that don't depend upon the usual bankers and investors. We need different types of legal regimes. I call them legal hacks on the law, so that commoning can be decriminalized where it's criminalized, like seed sharing or code sharing, and have affirmative support from the state. I think we need...
Is there a lot of work to do still in that direction?
There's a lot of work to do. I mean, the idea of commons public partnerships instead of public-private partnerships, which are basically a ripoff of the public treasury. We need commoners working with government, and government should realize it can't manage the distributed complexity of the world, and it has its own trust and legitimacy problems. Why not reach out to commoners, facilitate, encourage, give them technical, legal, financial support to have genuine authority and responsibility and genuine entitlements? You know, we need to... David Graeber once said to me that the problem with the left is they don't have an alternative to bureaucracy. And I think that's... You know, I think the commons is perhaps a viable alternative to bureaucracy if the state can get out of its deep alliance with capital and the market and in good faith provide these structures.
Yeah. Can they?
That's an open question. That's an open question.
Very open.
I mean, maybe we're going to have to get a little more into the crisis before they see the value of that. But I know, I think it will happen more at the municipal level than at the state or international, or the national or international level, because things are more pragmatically oriented and less ideological there.
Hey, and you're well aware of the situation in the Netherlands. You've been here multiple times, and you have a lot of contacts with.
Well,
how can we help? What can we do?
Keep teaching me. I've learned so much from Europeans, and I'm nourished by that. So I hope to keep learning.
Thank you, and we hope to keep learning from you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your wonderful books, and we will continue the talk after the live stream. People at home, thank you for watching. I hope you've been a little bit more informed and a lot more inspired by commons and commoning, and let's take it to the next level. Thank you.